Okay, let's begin.
Good morning, Patriot listeners. You're listening to AM 1280 The Patriot, Political Pitchforks. This is a relatively recent addition to the Patriot lineup. I am Susan Sjogren-Smith, and I am a longtime conservative and working to bring information to as many Republicans and conservative listeners as we can about the current affairs in Minnesota and the nation. And I'm here this morning with Jeremy. So good morning, Jeremy.
Good morning, Susan. I'm Jeremy Munson, a former legislator, three-term legislator, and activist in the Republican Party. And I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to introduce Pam Altendorf, current representative. She was elected in 2022. I supported her when she ran. She replaced Steve Drazkowski in the House as he moved over to the Senate. And Pam has been a great and vocal conservative in the Minnesota House. So we're excited to have her today to talk about things that are going on in the House and to talk about a little more detail about some elections issues. I think you've heard in the news about the federal government asking for voter data from Minnesota's Secretary of State, Steve Simon. And Steve Simon has denied their request to see the voter data to prove that we have free and fair elections in our state. So Pam, welcome to the show. Introduce the listeners to you, and tell us a little about your campaign and why you ran for House and what you'd like to get done.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Susan. I really appreciate you having me on today. Just one note, Barb Haley was in my district seat, and she moved on, ran for the Senate. So that was the seat that I filled. I'm from Red Wing area. It's District 20A, and ran for the first time in 2022. Actually, with that year, there was a lot of new Republicans that came into the House, 25 of us, and we have almost all the same story. It was right after COVID, and when you talk to them, it really started to get to be like, this is very interesting. Everybody has almost the same story, that new Republicans are coming into the House, tired of what happened during COVID, with walls, with Minneapolis burning, with saying, you can't go to church. Our kids in the school had to be masked, and it was just complete overreach of the government. So I think in Minnesota here, one encouraging note is to say that there's a lot of new Republicans that are coming up into the political ranks.
Yeah, sorry about that. I you didn't replace Steve's district, but boy, you really replaced Steve Drazkowski in the House.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Your voting record and the issues that you speak out against philosophically have replaced him. So I'm really thankful that you're serving.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And which committees are you serving on?
Yeah, absolutely. This year I'm on the elections. I'm the vice chair of the elections committee. I'm also on the education, finance, and children's and families. So those are my three committees that I'm serving on currently.
Three of my favorites.
Yeah. Thank you for serving on the education committee, because that one is not fun. And was it the education finance or education policy committee that you're on, or is it combined?
I'm the education finance, and yeah, it's been a difficult 3 years for our education, for our schools, and to sit there and watch everything, all the mandates, unfunded mandates that have been put on our schools. It's been difficult.
Yeah, and I know that the left always uses the term fully fund education, which is kind of a bottomless pit, given that our test scores and progress for our schools seems to be failing irrespective of the amount of money we throw at the schools in Minnesota, and it's difficult, especially to push back against all the DEI stuff. But I imagine with the kind of basically defunding of the Federal Department of Education, that committee is going to get a lot of work in the next year as Minnesota is actually granted more control over our schools, which I think is a good thing. And unfortunately for conservatives, the liberals will probably take our schools further to the left, because as much as we don't like the Federal Department of Education, it was probably a more balanced direction than Minnesota would like to be, or the Democrats would like to be. So you probably will have more to fight against on that committee next year. What is your thoughts on that?
I hope that we are going to keep revisiting this issue, because I actually think that sending it back to Minnesota is the only way to wake up all of the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of parents who have not really come to understand yet how serious the failure of our education system is in Minnesota, and how children are simply not being prepared from early childhood programs up through elementary school, that once kids are behind, it's so much harder to catch them up. And we are just failing kids.
Yeah,
and interfering with parents' ability to help their kids. Go ahead.
Absolutely. And the one thing that I'm seeing is whether you are really truly a conservative, a moderate, an independent, or I always say a common sense Democrat, is more and more people, as difficult it's been in Minnesota the last few years, more and more people are truly waking up to what's happening here. And possibly it just had to get this bad to wake up people. But on the education front, we had that $19 billion surplus, and certainly the Democrats, being in a complete trifecta, could have used that money to do anything that they wanted.
Anything.
And they put $2.2 billion towards our schools, and that was headline news, right? All over. $2.2 billion record funding went to our schools. And now today we are looking at schools making cuts, making tough decisions, and they're cutting educators because in return they have to fund the mandates that people in St. Paul passed and put these big burdens on these schools. So educators, and I think across the state, people are really seeing what's happening here in Minnesota.
Yep, I hope so. It's the only way we fix it. If you don't educate the people, they don't know how to vote. They don't even know what they're voting on, actually.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. And like I said, I always try to be really compassionate because I know it's been difficult. And I think it's been a wake up call in that people are starting to see it. And the next step is people need to move to action. We can't just watch. We have to be a part of the process to fix it.
Well, we're certainly seeing a record number of people running for school boards in school board elections, right, across the state. And that is the critical thing. And they're nonpartisan races, but we are seeing change.
Absolutely. And it is that local government that, people need to focus on, their school boards, their city councils. And we're starting to see those positions flip over. County commissioners, get active locally is going to have the biggest impact on you, your family, and your community.
Are you seeing that, Jeremy, where you're?
Yeah, I am. And in fact, I think Mankato, if it's Mankato Public Schools District or the Mankato City Council, I'm sorry, I forgot which one. I think it's the City Council, like shut down the meetings or is working to kind of silence dissent at meetings. And we've seen that quite a bit, where people are becoming more vocal at the meetings because the policies that are being enacted are being so politically charged. But I represented over 20 towns in my district, and there were so many school boards and city councils and even county commissioners that were Democrats in a deeply conservative district, because a lot of conservatives just didn't want to run for local office because they're business owners and whatever, and they don't want to get involved in politics to that level. But the Democrats have known for 30 or 40 years, this is how you build the bench for people to run for higher office, is you get them elected to school boards and city councils and work them up from there. And so it's difficult for Republicans to grab someone and have them run for state senate without having experience in campaigning.
In 2008, I had an interesting conversation during the Coleman reelection, the fight, right, about that race. And a very smart man said to me that the problem we have is Republicans do not raise their children to be in the government. They raise them to be business owners. And Democrats raise their children to be a part of the system. And so in these conservative districts, we end up having all these people representing us, being city managers, and we don't understand the implications of that until suddenly our whole city is changing, our communities are changing, the Met Council is being empowered. We don't know why, right? And I think this is a really critical point for all of us to really be educating our neighbors and the people we go to church with and our friends, the parents of our children's friends, about the need to get involved. Period.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one thing, one of the new people that just came into the House this last year in the Education Finance Committee, he's a businessman, a very successful businessman. And after one of the meetings, he said, I think the biggest problem here at the state legislature is just the lack of having any kind of idea of finances. And, we're running it. One time in my education committee, just tell you a funny story, but I said,
wait, I want to hold that story because we hit a hard break right now. And so we're going to come back and we're going to pick up with your story. Thanks for listening.
Okay, let's begin.
Welcome back, Patriot listeners, to Political Pitchforks on AM 1280 The Patriot. This is Susan Smith. I'm here with Jeremy Munson and Representative Pam Altendorf, who was just about to tell us a story at the end of the last segment. So, Pam, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, no, I was just saying one time in the Education Committee, and I'm new into the legislature, it's 2023, and we're listening to all these bills and, money, all this funding. And one time I just said, gosh, I just feel like we should run this more like a business. And the Democrats turned around, looked at me like gasping. And it was almost like and they were like, but this is the government. And I'm like, that's the problem.
Boy, she just summed it up right there. That is the problem.
Yeah.
That is the problem.
Yeah. I do look when we're in the House and the Republicans are on the right side and the Democrats are on the left side, the makeup of the body of the Republicans are, like you said, business owners, and there's law enforcement and farmers, a lot of people who have to earn their paycheck. And then on the left side, it's a lot of attorneys, activists, nonprofit people. So there is a divide in how people have earned the money. And on one side, it seems like it just kind of comes and they don't have a good grasp of how money actually is created.
Ideological.
Right. Pam, I'd like to switch topics to the other committee that you serve on, the Elections Committee, because our state's elections are so important. And especially if you are conservative and you want to get involved in politics and you have this great idea on how to help a candidate win, or you want to be a candidate yourself, you can fight like hell and then realize that we're not the ones counting the ballots, or that if our candidates lose by a narrow margin, which seems to happen every cycle, it's very difficult to audit the election or to try to resolve disputes on these narrow wins. In this last election, of course, you came in after the 2020 election. You got pretty involved in the 2020 kind of recount or the aftermath. I think Mike Lindell endorsed your campaign when you ran for House. And what we saw this last fall, where the House is now tied as a result of the seat in Shakopee, where we saw the Republican win pretty handedly on election night, but then the results were taken down, and then the Democrat was posted with a very, very small margin of victory that you and I both kind of took to social media to challenge because of the voter data that came out of the Secretary of State's office. Can you explain that situation in the Brad Tabke race?
Yeah, being on the Elections Committee, I did get really involved it was the Tapke, and then Aaron Paul was the Republican. I got really involved in that race because, we need to understand this, but if we don't have trust in our elections, we just have nothing. We have to have trust and transparency in our elections. That's why I'm very happy to serve on the Elections Committee because, as you were saying, Jeremy, everything else you can be passionate about, taxes or this or that. And if we don't have fair elections, I just am not sure that anything else is as important. But in that Shakopee race, as we all know, Aaron Paul, the Republican, he was winning by quite a large number. And then all the numbers got pulled, zeroed out, and then they came back up and he just won by a small amount. And then later we found out 20.
I want to just cut. So Aaron Paul won by like 500 votes, and with 100% of the precincts reporting, I think is what it showed on the Secretary of State's website, right?
Yeah, I have screenshots. Yeah.
Then it was pulled down.
Yeah, it was completely pulled down, completely zeroed out. And then when it came back up, Tapke won. And again, this just does not do anything for building confidence, making people feel like there's more questions than answers at this point. So just digging into that information, we found that there was like 30 duplicate ballots. And I also, one thing that's very concerning to me, that should be concerning to everyone, I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican, but it was like I was doing data requests, and at one point Scott County just said, you can't get that information. And it's really not protected data information that I'm asking for. And again, if there's nothing to hide, then we should be going for full transparency. And then that's what's actually happening right now with the federal government, with the Department of Justice requesting information, and they're getting denied currently at the same time by Steve Simon from the Secretary of State office.
And by the way, what they're asking for are the voter rolls, right? And it's very interesting because we, on the one hand, everybody has the right, every Minnesota citizen, eligible voter, has the right to seek those rolls. And I personally have purchased dozens and dozens and dozens of them because what we've learned is that the only way to have any accountability in the voter roll system is for people to get many, many, many cross sections of that information, because they turn voters on and off. And once a voter's turned off, if you don't have proof they were ever there, you now can't get it, right? And you can't get any possible day of data or information that will tell you in this race or any race who actually completely voted. There's no way to recreate it the way they've set up the system. You can't.
Yeah, it's clear.
Yeah, and I just want to interject and to kind of show people why they should really care about this Shakopee race is because the number of people that voted in each of the precincts on election night and chose a candidate, right? You can also vote for federal office, but not choose a local candidate. But the people that actually cast a ballot in those precincts does not match the number of voters who cast a vote in that race on the Secretary of State's voter rolls, right? The data that shows who can vote, and that is what really was of such a great concern to people like Pam and I, because the numbers don't match, and so it looks like you had ballot stuffing or duplicate ballots cast in the Shakopee race that was enough to make up the margin of victory for Brad Tabke.
Yeah, in a race like this, when it's only by 14 votes, that's where these things become so very important. In other races, you're never going to see these type of things, but that's how closely we were looking at this because of the margin being so close at only 14 votes.
Right. And Secretary of State Steve Simon had in a previous year in committee testified that there is voter fraud in every election, but that the percentage is fairly small. But there are races like this where he won by 13 votes that makes a difference. And it's a consequential race because the House is tied because of the House voting to seat Tabke. And although you can challenge things in court, the ultimate arbiter of elections in Minnesota is the legislature. And so the legislature voted to seat him and not to challenge it. And that was with some power sharing agreement that the Republicans made with the Democrats, so that the Republicans could have a person elected as speaker, even though they're sharing power. But seating this seat, I think, was probably the worst decision the House made in not challenging this, because you're going to suffer for 2 years having seated this person, and I don't think you'll ever uncover the fraud or the disparity in votes, because we're not sharing this voter information with the federal government.
But one thing I think is important to say about what Steve Simon is asserting, right, is that he has absolutely no possible way to draw the conclusion that he is drawing. And there's a whole level of election-related matters that occur by accident because we unintentionally or intentionally provide information to people who live in Minnesota who may or may not be eligible to vote where they're voting or vote at all. But we've created a system that actually is run by the Secretary of State that provides sort of disinformation to voters, election judges. And so we actually have processes in place that allow the violation of Minnesota law that is not able to be challenged because there is no court in the state hardly at all that will hear election cases. They get thrown out for just all kinds of crazy reasons. And so to me, he really is speaking out of turn and actually often oversteps his bounds. He's supposed to be a record keeper and a provider of records. And instead, he oftentimes wades into issues that really the Attorney General probably should be addressing, not him, right?
Yeah, it was Steve Simon, like he said before this last election that his goals were high turnout and low drama. That was I think, a direct quote. And I look at that all the time, and it's a terrible goal. It should be high transparency, and we're not providing that. In fact, what I have seen they have diluted our elections even more since 2023. They passed legislation. We now have 46 days to vote in the state of Minnesota. One person can vouch up to 8 people in precinct. Right. We have pop-up voting booths, and want to talk about securing the ballot. How do you truly secure a ballot if there's a pop-up booth on a college campus? That would be completely impossible. And one of them that people, I don't even know, sometimes I think people might think this is a joke or satire, but the Democrats in 2023, they removed needing an address to vote. So you could literally say that you live under the bridge on such and such street, and the election judges have to say, okay, go ahead, here's your ballot, go ahead and vote. And people can't even believe it. So they're diluting even more, making our elections secure and transparent. And that's what's happened over the last, 2 or 3 years here with Steve Simon. They say it's all, they want high turnout. They want every person to be able to vote. But in doing that is completely mudding up the whole system.
They leave out in that statement that they want every eligible voter to vote. What they want is people to vote, and they don't necessarily care where they vote or if they're voting where they should or even if they should vote. So I think this issue, there's a lot more that we can say and talk about, and I hope we pick up some of this as we come back from the break, because as you're working on how do we fix the election system as a legislator, what I think we also need to talk about is if Republicans and conservatives and those Democrats who really do understand there's a problem don't begin to get engaged and support this dialogue directly through contacting their legislators about it, we aren't going to solve this problem at all. Right. So we'll be back shortly after this break.
Okay, let's begin.
Good morning. I want to welcome you back to Political Pitchforks on AM 1280 The Patriot. I'm Susan Smith here with Jeremy Munson and Representative Pam Altendorf. And let's just hop right back into the election discussion. Pam, you had a ton of experience with canvassing elections, and this is why those voter rolls are so critical to ensuring that we have transparent elections and that the results of these elections can be trusted by voters. So you want to talk a little bit about what happened?
Right. So going back to that Shakopee race, for $46, you can get the voter information. And in getting that during this, when we were questioning the race, we had found that there was 30 duplicate ballots. So what we did, because we had the names, we actually canvassed, and we were able to talk to a lot of those people. Just to give you an idea, so it would show that they voted by absentee ballot. It would show the date that was accepted, and then that same person would show that they voted again same day in person. So we talked to some people and, would ask, like, can you share with me how was your voting experience? Oh, I chose to vote absentee ballot. One of them was a college student, so they weren't going to be there. Another one has a daycare, so it's really hard for her to leave during the day. So we're talking to people, why did you, and they were excited about voting absentee ballot. They talked about voting absentee ballot. And then we would go, and did you vote in person? Because it showed they also registered same day in person. They'd be like, no, I just explained to you how this great absentee ballot process worked for me. So we're showing people with 2 voting records, 2 voting histories. And again, in a race that was by 14 votes, this should be completely unacceptable to any person and does not build confidence in our elections.
So I just want to kind of sum it up. We had the Republican winning by hundreds of votes with 100% reporting. The data was taken down at the Secretary of State's office for hours. And when they put it back up, it showed Brad Tapke had won by 14 votes or 13 votes, something like that. And after all the data, after the election and the dust settled, the Secretary of State's voter rolls showed that there were 90 some extra ballots or 90 some fewer ballots cast than what the precincts were reporting. And within that data, there were over 30 voters who had cast 2 ballots or had 2 ballots recorded in their voter file.
Yep. So there was way more questions than answers. And a lot of this just gets kind of mocked or saying and the other thing that I thought was fascinating is, excuse me, the county has a deadline of when they're supposed to have their official records in. And Scott County I was pulling the data week by week, and the data continues to change. So even though there is a set deadline that the counties are supposed to submit their data, for some reason within the system, they think they can continue to change and manipulate that data. And they were perfectly fine with that. Go
I
ahead.
have a quick question. So one of the things I think because very few people actually read the law, which is written in plain language, right? So you don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be, you just read it, right? And we can see that as to this particular issue with absentee voting, there is a serious problem in that, number one, you can send your ballot in, but there is a delay from when they're required to process that ballot from when they get it, which then creates this sort of window where people don't always, maybe they sent their ballot in and it's not in the system yet. They check their vote. It says they weren't voting. So they go to vote again because they're afraid they're not going to have their vote counted, right? And it used to be that those absentee ballots would be brought, every ballot that wasn't in the system would be brought to the polling place. It would be processed after the polls closed so they could verify that these absentee voters didn't come in and vote on election day for this reason, hypothetically. And that doesn't happen. And so there's this thousands and thousands of ballots come in across the state to these absentee ballot boards. And they're not in the system. But the person who sent it in, we know within Hennepin County, it can take 7 to 8 days to mail something in Hennepin County to somewhere in Hennepin County. 7 to 8 days. So we have no idea. So this issue of if a absentee vote has not been put into the system as being received, right? Then if you're the person that casts one of those, could be tens of thousands of ballots, you might actually think you should go vote on election day because you can't tell if your vote's been counted. But once you cast it, there's no way to stop your ballot from being counted twice, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah, correct. And these are just some of the problems. I mean, we saw on the Hennepin County, we saw that on the absentee ballot board, that was a lawsuit that they didn't have equal representation of Democrats and Republican judges. So there's a lot of questions going on with the absentee ballots. And one more thing I'd like to bring up that I think your listeners would be really interested in is being on the elections committee. I was serving on that conference committee, and that's at the end where you have to take the House bill in the Senate and you have to make the elections bill match. And one thing that the counties, they were requesting was the absentee ballot drop-off used to be 3 p.m. The Democrats changed that in 2023 to be 8 p.m. So the counties were really struggling in 2024. And again, this was a county request. This wasn't a Republican priority. The counties were asking to move that drop-off back to 3 p.m. And when I got into the conference committee, that was one of the biggest fights. And even Steve Simon got involved. They did not want to change it from 8 p.m., back to 3 p.m., which the counties were requesting. Eventually, we did settle it to 5 p.m. So that now is in law that the drop-off is 5 p.m. And just on a side note, I talked to one of the Democrats in a hallway, and I was like, come on, tell me, what is the big deal with this absentee ballot drop-off time? The counties want it. Why are you pushing so hard on it? And he was like, well, Democrats, we want to give every person a chance to vote. It's all about getting every chance to vote. And I'm like, but it's election day. If they did not cast an absentee ballot and they didn't vote in 46 days, guess what? The polls are open. They can go to the poll.
Right.
So it totally ruined his argument. He had no argument at that point. And then he kind of looked at me with this puzzled look, because it was right. You can go vote. We're not suppressing anyone from voting. If they didn't get their absentee ballot off, they can absolutely go vote in person.
That is the number one issue, I think, for me, is that everybody knows when the election is. And frankly, I think that they should have an absentee deadline that it should have to be postmarked 10 days beforehand, period. And that gives plenty of time for it to show up. And if you don't do that, then plan to vote in person. It just doesn't make any sense why we bend over backwards. And it used to be, the case law always was until recently, that it was, the burden was on you as the voter to get your ballot properly submitted on time. And now they just do everything they can to facilitate it. So I don't know, Jeremy, why don't you?
I'd love to talk about a common sense solution that I'm shocked that we couldn't get through in the legislature, and that is provisional ballots. For those of you who don't know, I mean, obviously Minnesota doesn't have a voter ID. And that's a subject of frustration for conservatives, and they, hopefully Republican legislators will continue to fight to implement voter ID in the state. But of all the states that don't have voter ID, or of all the states that allow same-day registration, where you don't have to be registered to vote until the day or the minute you go vote, they have provisional ballots, which are simply allowing anyone to vote, but that they'll set that ballot aside with your documentation showing who you are, and then they will open and verify that information sometimes days after the election, because it does take days to verify who you are. You are who you say you are. And the reason why that's so important is because if you go in to a Minnesota polling station at 6 p.m. on election day, and you've never voted in your life, and you have no ID, and as Pam pointed out, some random person who's a registered voter could just say, "Yeah, I know this guy. He's in fact, I vouched for someone from Arizona who moved to Minnesota and had been at my house for 3 weeks. He didn't have a Minnesota driver's license, had no utility bills. I could go to the polling station and just vouch for him, and they let him vote." But provisional ballots would basically hold that person's ballot with their information until they could prove that he wasn't voting in other elections or in different precincts or whatever, and then count the ballot. In Minnesota, because we don't have provisional ballots, that ballot is, once it's opened and scanned, there's no way to attach that ballot to that person again to pull their ballot back out. And so after the election, when we have 20,000 people whose voter registration the day of doesn't match, like their social security number doesn't match, or we see that they voted twice, there's no way to pull the ballot back. It's already been counted. So that's why provisional balloting is so important. And I've talked to liberals who listen to this and go, yeah, we should have provisional ballot. Let them vote the same day, let them register the same day without an ID, but at least set their information aside so that we can verify that who they are before we count their ballot. That makes sense.
This issue of provisional voting is so critical, and I hope we have every legislator who's a Republican talk about this, because I believe there are only 2 states that don't have provisional voting, Minnesota and Idaho. And I would argue in Idaho, it's a much smaller state, and they probably are more likely to know their neighbors than we are, maybe. But the idea that 48 states have all recognized provisional voting, some form of it is necessary, and Minnesota clings to the idea that we're counting everything no matter what, is incredible to me.
Mm-hmm. And absolutely, like what we saw with the provisional ballots, but what we saw in Shakopee, it would have made a difference. There's a lot of races it's not, but in a race this close, it could have made a difference.
Right. Well, and it certainly protects those voters who sent their ballot in and they haven't been counted yet. They didn't intend to vote twice, and they did, and they didn't intend it, but they did it because we have a failure to keep the record so that they can check and track their ballot like they're supposed to be able to track. So we've got a lot of work to do. And I think part of that work is really educating people. And, Pam, you do a great job. Jeremy, you're doing it all the time, too. We have to get Democrats and Republicans educated about the importance of running elections that are transparent and fair for all citizens who are eligible to vote, right? We want those systems to work, because if Republicans win and the Democrats don't trust, that's just as bad as Democrats winning and Republicans not trusting. So we got a lot of work to do. We'll be back after this break to get at more of these issues. Thanks, Pam and Jeremy.
Okay, let's begin.
Welcome back, listeners, to Political Pitchforks on AM 1280 The Patriot. This is Susan Smith here with Jeremy Munson and Representative Pam Altendorf. And we are in our last segment. We've got a ton to talk about, so we're going to just jump right into these new investigations that are happening with the Department of Justice in Minnesota. And Pam, why don't you give us some perspective as a legislator? What's happening?
Absolutely. There's no lack of political news happening in Minnesota. We're always leading the nation in political news. It's a little bit crazy right now, but the Department of Justice, they sent a letter to Secretary of State Steve Simon and asked for voter registration rolls and other election data, and they gave him 30 days to comply with that request. Just last Friday, then, the Office of the Secretary of State responded and said that it wasn't a legitimate request because they did not show clear legal justification of why they needed that data. And then they also said in the letter that they didn't prove that they would keep that data secure. Now, Minnesota, we participate in receiving funds from the federal government for our elections. And so that is something that's been going on, I believe, since 2002 was when that was created. And we are receiving federal dollars that's helping to fund our elections. So this transfer of data back and forth actually has been happening for many years. This is not a new thing. But now that they were asking for very specific things, they said no. They denied it. And you've seen this in the news. But sitting on the elections committee, being the co-vice chair of the elections committee, myself and Chair Dwayne Quam and the other members of the election committee, we did write a letter to Steve Simon this last week, and we're urging him to comply with the federal request to supply this. And by not complying really is a black eye in election integrity. And that's what this is all about. We need to have more transparency, not less. And that's what I think everyone, rightfully so, is up in arms about.
And I think the law allows the transfer of the information very clearly. And it doesn't give a lot of details about the law enforcement request, but it does allow it.
Absolutely. That's our opinion.
Right.
Yeah, and, for constitutional conservatives like me, who kind of look to the U.S. Constitution, which says that the states and the state legislatures are the ones that set the time, place, and manner of elections, really gets the federal government out of our elections, because I don't want to see elections federalized. But with this HAVA money, the Help America Vote Act money that started in 2002, Minnesota has received probably $10 million or more of funding from the federal government that goes into the Secretary of State's office for helping run elections. And so part of that is that you can get money from the federal government, but in return, you have to show them that you're complying with this act. And that is why they deserve this data. And, Minnesota can't claim that that they're risking this private information, because we saw St. Paul this last week and their massive data breach because they can't handle data. And we know the Minnesota State IT group has data breaches frequently. So, but this is very important information. It needs to be shown to the public that we're complying and that we have free and fair elections, because free and fair elections are directly tied to people's faith in government. If you work to elect people and the elections are not fair, then you don't have faith that the government is actually following the will of the people.
Right. And, Jeremy, I always say, I understand, again, it's frustrating to be a conservative in the state of Minnesota right now. It's been frustrating, but we have to make sure that the public understands our elections are fair. And what's happening right now with the DOJ is, you come in when I was elected, you come in and you really think you're going to make a difference. And you kind of realize very quickly we're trapped here in Minnesota in this Democrat controlled box. We have Walz as the governor, Attorney General is Keith Ellison, Secretary Simon is in that position. So your every avenue you would have to maybe combat some of these things, you seem like you get blocked. And then we also have Minnesota Supreme Court with 7 liberal judges, right? So going federal, truly, I believe, Jeremy, although I know that it's the state's responsibility to administer our elections, is we need help here in Minnesota. So this federal investigation is needed to kind of break open and shine a big light on what's going on in Minnesota.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. Amy Klobuchar 6 or 8 years ago was promoting federalizing elections and trying to mandate that all, counties in the country had to use a specific software or a specific voting machine. And when we do that, when we centralize the elections, then we leave them susceptible to being hacked and stuff. It's better that each county get to do different things, use different machines or different paper ballots or whatever they want to do, so that you can't hijack, a whole presidential election based on that.
So I believe that we could do 1,000 hours on election issues in Minnesota and around the country, but unfortunately we have 5 minutes left in this segment, and I do want to get to one more issue. And I know, Jeremy, you are ready to hit this hard. It's related to cannabis licensure to sell and the social equity rules that have been put in place. And I think it's the first time really this has been so clearly implemented in Minnesota, and it's a problem. So go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, well, Alpha News ran an article yesterday on the state's first cannabis retailer license down here in Albert Lee, in my area, where the city denied an applicant. And Alpha News is trying to make it about, just kind of about marijuana being legalized, and everybody's up in arms about it. But the real story here is that the state is using an applicant's social equity score to determine if they can be granted a license. So it's not based on, have they checked all the boxes? Do they have a business that, meets the standards, or, Department of Health inspection or whatever? This is about someone's personal social equity score. Have they served time in jail? And actually they get more credit for being in the criminal justice system for selling marijuana. They get the positive score. Are they non-white? Are they not male? Are they identify as some other gender? Are they LGBTQ? And who knows what else goes into the social equity score? And the reason why this is so concerning is this is the first time I've seen licensure, permission from the government based on your social equity score. This is what we saw during COVID in China, where people could travel and conduct business if they had the vaccine, because the vaccine status was tied to their social equity score. This is the big concern of the story, and this is what should freak people out about the government starting to do this, especially when they're gathering information under the Department of Human Rights on complaints and what language you use. If you offend someone using language, it can be reported to the state, and they keep track of all this information.
And I think, Jeremy and Pam, I'd love for you to comment on this. This is actually very clearly articulated in the social equity policy, that it's in fact a reparations program. It's a form of reparations, because they specifically have done this to fix past wrongs for people who were disproportionately affected by illegal marijuana law, that made it illegal. And so the idea that we're going down a path of reparations is unbelievable to me. And nobody's talking about it except for Jeremy.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah, Minnesota, we are just off the rails here, and you're seeing it. There's many times on the House floor where we have said, that's a lawsuit. If you pass this, that's a lawsuit. And this is just one more of those things. We're discriminating against other people. I think in the last year there was a lawsuit, it was on grants. I don't remember all the details, but it was to startup farmers. And it was basically anybody but a white male, could receive this. And I believe there was a lawsuit, and they won. So again, we're just going down that same track, and would like to go back to the good old fashioned hiring and getting things based on your ability, and stop all this labeling. I think many people would appreciate that.
Yeah, pandering for voters, really.
Well, the federal government's required under the 14th Amendment to treat everyone equally under the law, and this social equity score does the exact opposite. So much of race and basically racism is threaded into so much legislation that it shouldn't be allowed. The social equity score should be overturned.
Yeah, I agree. Pam, as we wrap up this segment and the show today, I just have to say that you have so much work to do, and I think Republicans like you that are willing really to step up and honestly tell the truth to the voters, to the people of Minnesota. And you're reaching people far beyond your district, right? It's just critical. I can't thank you enough. And I'm sure, Jeremy, maybe you want to close up today talking about that, being a legislator, and how important it is to be fearless.
Yeah, you have to decide that you're going to step away from your career or whatever to go and fight to make change in Minnesota. And I would invite people who are looking to run for office to reach out to Pam for advice on how to run a campaign and the issues to campaign on and how to be effective when you get to St. Paul and pick your battles, because there are so many things to fight for. In the legislature does so much damage to the taxpayers and to liberty in Minnesota.
Yeah. So Pam, again, I thank you. I hope you come on again to talk with us. You are just a true asset and a great voice for people across the state. So again, you've been listening to Political Pitchforks every Saturday morning, 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., politicalpitchforks.com. We will have links to the topics we discussed today available on the website. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.